My name is Specialist Rose Owen. I'm 28 years old, and I'm an artilleryman in the United States Army. Here at Fort Sill, my life is order and discipline. But the phone call that afternoon came from a world of chaos. The voice of my stepmother, Janet, hissed through the phone from Charleston, dripping with that sweet Southern poison. "Rose, darling, that little trust fund of your mother's, well, it's going to serve a better purpose now. It's Tiffany's. She needs it for a wedding in Nantucket, not for you to play your pointless little soldier games." She chuckled, a sound that made the blood in my veins run cold. "I told your father, if your mother were alive, she'd be ashamed to death of the daughter you've become. Throwing away a respectable life for a cheap uniform." Every word was a bullet, aimed directly at my mother's legacy, at my sacrifice. She expected me to cry, to beg. But she didn't know she wasn't talking to a daughter anymore. She was talking to a strategist. And she had just walked right into a trap that had been set for the last 6 months. If you've ever been made to feel like an outsider in your own home by your own family, let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe, because this story of betrayal and of justice served with military precision is for you. The click of the phone disconnecting was the only proof the call had happened. For a long minute, I didn't move, seated at the government issue desk in my barracks room. The receiver was still slick with sweat in my hand. Outside the dusty expanse of Fort Sill, Oklahoma, baked under a relentless sun. Inside there was only an oppressive silence, broken by the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. A sound I usually ignored, but now felt like it was buzzing inside my skull. I stared at a tiny scuff mark on the cinder block wall above my cot. A single bead of sweat traced a slow, cold path down my temple. The air conditioning was working, but a heat entirely separate from the Oklahoma weather was blooming in my chest. Shock. That's the first phase. They teach you that shock can kill faster than the wound itself. It numbs you, slows your thinking, makes you a liability. My training kicked in before my heart could betray me. Breathe in, 4 seconds. Hold, 4 seconds. Breathe out, 4 seconds. Hold, 4 seconds. The box breathing. A standard operating procedure for moments just like this, when chaos threatened to breach the perimeter of your control. I executed it with drilled precision. My heart rate, which had hammered against my ribs like an incoming mortar strike, slowly fell back into its regulated rhythm. The discipline was a shield, an armor forged in years of training. But beneath it, the internal storm was gathering strength. Ashamed to death. Cheap uniform. Janet's words weren't just words. They were shrapnel, tearing through the quiet sanctuary of my mind. They echoed, not in her saccharine drawl, but as a cold clinical report my brain replayed on a loop. Pointless soldier games. The phrase ricocheted off the memory of a 20-mile ruck march, my back screaming under the weight of my pack. A cheap uniform. It flashed against the image of me in my dress blues at a comrade's funeral. The fabric representing a promise I had made to my country, to myself. And then, the final, unforgivable strike. Your mother would be ashamed. The image of my mother flickered behind my eyes. Not her smile, not her reading to me as a child. No, my mind, in its cruelty, conjured the last image I ever had of her, frail and weak in a hospital bed, her face etched with pain. To attach the word ashamed to that memory, it was a desecration. A hot white rage surged up from the pit of my stomach. It was a visceral thing, a force that wanted to lash out, to put a fist through my wall locker, to scream until my lungs burned. My hands clenched so tight my knuckles turned white, my jaw locked. The muscles in my back and shoulders coiled like springs. But just as quickly, the impulse was contained. Discipline, relentless and absolute, slammed down on the emotion. Rage is a fire. Uncontrolled, it consumes you. Controlled, it can power an engine. I had spent years learning to channel fire. I would not let Janet be the one to burn me down. I would use her fire to fuel my own. Slowly, methodically, I stood up. My movements were not of a grieving daughter, but of a soldier carrying out a procedure. This was a new SOP, one I was writing in real time. Title: Emotional Contamination Protocol. Step 1. Restore order to the immediate environment. I walked to my cot where my freshly laundered Army combat uniform lay in a neat pile. I picked up the jacket, the digital camouflage pattern rough and familiar under my fingertips. I began to fold it, not just folding, but executing a ritual. I folded the sleeves with razor-sharp precision, creating perfect 90-degree angles. I smoothed out every wrinkle, my hands moving with an economy of motion that left no room for error. Next, the trousers, creased exactly along their seams. Each fold was a deliberate act of defiance against the chaos Janet had tried to inject into my world. Then, I turned to my combat boots, already polished to a mirror shine by the door. I picked them up with my polishing kit, sat on the edge of my cot, and popped open the tin of kiwi polish. I began the familiar, circular motions on the leather toe. The rhythmic whisk of the brush, the faint, chemical smell of the wax. It was a form of meditation, a way of taking a messy world and creating a small, perfect point of order within it. With every circle, I buffed away the emotional residue of that phone call. With every pass of the cloth, I hardened my resolve. This wasn't just about clean boots. It was about preparing my armor, about transforming the turbulent flood of emotion into a single, focused point of absolute clarity. When I was done, the boots gleamed. I placed them side by side, perfectly aligned. My environment was secure. Order was restored. The protocol was complete. Now, it was time for the next phase. I got on my knees and reached under the metal frame of my cot. My fingers found the cold edges of my footlocker. It was a standard issue metal box, olive drab, with Owen stenciled in black letters on the front. It was heavy as I dragged it across the linoleum floor, the sound echoing in the silent room. I unlatched the two heavy clasps, the metallic snap-clack sounding like a weapon being armed. I lifted the lid. Inside, there were no weapons, no field gear, no mementos. There was only one thing, a thick, 3-ring binder, meticulously organized. On the spine, a crisp white label was affixed. It read, Contingency Plan, Nightingale. Resting on top was a single, old letter, the envelope yellowed with age. My mother's handwriting. I picked it up, my calloused fingers tracing her elegant script. For a fleeting moment, the soldier receded, and I was just her daughter, feeling the profound ache of her absence. I allowed myself that one moment of vulnerability, a final breath before the plunge. Then I placed the letter carefully on my desk. I lifted the heavy binder from the footlocker and set it down in front of me. I opened it to the first page, a detailed table of contents. My face was calm, my breathing even. The storm inside me had passed, leaving behind a cold, quiet, and unshakable resolve. Janet thought she had won a battle. She had no idea she had just started a war. The operation had begun. The binder, heavy with the architecture of my counter-offensive, sat closed on the desk. My eyes, however, were fixed on the letter from my mother. The paper was fragile, the ink slightly faded, but her presence felt as real as the cold metal of the chair beneath me. Looking at her handwriting, the past wasn't a distant country. It was a room I could step right back into. And in my mind, I did. I stepped back to the beginning of the end, the day the slow, methodical erosion of my world began. It started 6 months after we buried my mother. I was 18, navigating the raw, open wound of grief, a landscape my father seemed equally lost in. Then, Janet arrived. She showed up at our front door in Charleston, a vision of Southern propriety, holding a homemade hummingbird cake on a pristine ceramic platter. Her smile was as sweet and cloying as the pineapple and banana in that cake. "I just want to help heal this broken family," she'd said, her voice a soft, honeyed whisper that promised comfort but concealed a calculated invasion. My father, starved for any semblance of normalcy, welcomed her in. And with her came the changes. They were subtle at first, like a quiet insurgency. A new set of decorative pillows on the living room couch. Different curtains in the dining room. I told myself it didn't matter. But then came the day I walked downstairs and saw it. An empty space on the wall above the fireplace. The large framed portrait of my mother, my favorite one, where she was laughing on the bow of our sailboat, was gone. In its place hung a generic, uninspired painting of a marshy landscape. When I asked my father, he shifted his weight, unable to meet my eyes. It was Janet who answered, placing a gentle hand on my arm. "We just wanted to make the room feel a little more neutral, honey," she said, her voice dripping with counterfeit sympathy. "So Tiffany doesn't feel like an outsider." Tiffany, her 16-year-old daughter. And my father, my own father, just nodded in agreement. He didn't see it as an erasure. He saw it as a compromise. That was the first time I realized my home was becoming occupied territory, and I was losing ground. A year later, the occupation escalated into active neglect. A tropical storm, one of those furious, late-summer tempests, slammed into the South Carolina coast. I was 19, driving home from a part-time job when the roads started to flood. My old sedan stalled out, water rising around the tires. I called my dad, my voice tight with panic. "I'm coming to get you," he said immediately, the familiar reassurance in his voice a balm to my frayed nerves. But then I heard Janet's voice in the background, a murmur at first, then clearer. "But darling, Tiffany is terrified of thunderstorms. She needs you here with her. Rose is strong, she can take care of herself." There was a pause, a moment of silence that stretched into an eternity. And then my father's voice came back on the line, stripped of its earlier conviction. "Janet's right, Rose. You're tough. You'll figure it out." He hung up. I had to abandon my car and walk the 3 miles home in the driving rain and whipping wind. When I finally stumbled through the front door, soaked to the bone and shivering, my father looked up from the couch where he was sitting with Janet and a whimpering Tiffany. He didn't hug me. He didn't wrap me in a towel. He just offered a weak smile and said, "See? I knew you'd be okay." The slights and insults became more brazen over time, culminating in Tiffany's 21st birthday party. By then, I was home on leave from basic training. Janet insisted on throwing a lavish affair at the Charleston Yacht Club, a place that reeked of old money and social pretense. She also insisted I wear a frilly, bubblegum pink dress she'd bought for me, something so utterly contrary to my identity that it felt like a costume for a role I didn't want to play. Standing there, surrounded by Tiffany's sorority sisters and their polo shirt-wearing boyfriends, I had never felt more like an alien. The peak of the evening came with Janet's toast. She stood, champagne flute in hand, beaming at her daughter. "To my beautiful girl, Tiffany," she began, her voice ringing with pride, "who will soon graduate with a degree in art history and has the world at her feet." Then she turned her gaze to me, her smile tightening just a fraction. "And a toast to Rose, as well, who is serving her country." The way she said it, the slight pause, the tilt of her head, turned the statement into a public demotion. It wasn't a tribute, it was a condescending pat on the head. A few of the guests tittered into their glasses. My father just stood there, clapping along with everyone else, oblivious. Or perhaps unwilling to see. But the final, irrevocable act of betrayal, the one that severed the last thread of hope I had for my father, happened a year later. It was the day he sold the Elizabeth. That was the name of the sailboat he and my mom had bought together, the one they had poured their weekends into restoring. It was named after her. It was more than a boat, it was a floating monument to their love, to the family we once were. He sold it without telling me. I found out when I saw the down payment receipt for a brand new Mercedes C-Class, a graduation gift for Tiffany, lying on his desk. When I confronted him, my voice shaking with a grief I thought I had buried, he wouldn't look at me. He just stared out the window at the driveway where my mother's old station wagon used to be. "The money from the boat paid for this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He finally turned, his face a mask of irritation. "Don't be selfish, Rose," he snapped, his voice sharp and cold. "Your mother is gone. We have to move on." If you've ever had a precious memory or a piece of your heart treated like it was disposable, please support this story with a like and comment "The Elizabeth" below if you believe some things should never be for sale. In that moment, hearing those words, something inside me broke. It wasn't just grief. It was the horrifying, gut-wrenching realization that my father hadn't just been manipulated or worn down. He had actively chosen a side. He had taken the most sacred memory of my mother and liquidated it to appease his new family. He wasn't a casualty in Janet's war anymore. He had become her willing ally. And I was the enemy. My father's words, "We have to move on," echoed in my mind for weeks. But what he meant was that he had to move on, and I was part of the past he was leaving behind. He and Janet and Tiffany were a complete unit, a new family built on the ashes of the old one. There was no room for me at their table anymore. The realization was a cold, hard stone in my gut. If they had chosen their side, then I had to choose my own battlefield. A few days later, I found myself standing in front of the Army recruitment office in a strip mall off the highway. The afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt, making the air shimmer. Through the glass door, I could see a poster of a soldier in full gear, their face set with a look of grim determination. Janet's mocking voice slithered into my memory. "Only people with no other options join the military." A bitter smile touched my lips. "You were right, Janet," I thought to myself. "At home, I have no other options." This wasn't an escape, it was a reconstruction. I was turning myself in for a complete rebuild. I pushed open the door and stepped into the cool, air-conditioned office, leaving the girl they thought they knew behind on the hot pavement. Fort Sill, Oklahoma, became my forge. The sweeping sun-scorched plains and the relentless blue sky were a world away from the genteel humidity of Charleston. There were no garden parties here, no whispered gossip behind manicured hands. There was only dirt, sweat, and the absolute, unambiguous clarity of the mission. It was the harshest place I'd ever been, and for the first time in years, I felt safe. The rules here were clear. Effort was rewarded. Your past didn't matter, only your performance did. My new life was measured in punishing increments. Pre-dawn ruck marches under the weight of a 50-pound pack, the straps digging into my shoulders until they were raw, my lungs burning with every step on the rugged terrain. I learned the intricate language of artillery, the mathematics of trajectory, and wind speed. I learned to break down and reassemble the complex machinery of the M109 Paladin, my hands becoming slick with grease and grime. The deafening roar of the howitzer firing became a kind of music, a violent symphony that drowned out the ghosts of my past. Physically, I was at a disadvantage. Many of the men in my platoon were bigger, stronger, and faster. In the beginning, I was always the one struggling to keep up, the one finishing last. But I refused to break. Humiliation was a luxury I couldn't afford. While they were back in the barracks at night, sharing jokes and stories from home, I was in the empty, echoing gym. I did push-ups until my arms trembled and collapsed beneath me. I did sit-ups until my abs felt like they were on fire. Every drop of sweat that hit the dusty floor felt like I was washing away a piece of the weakness they had tried to instill in me, replacing it with something harder, something forged. In the small worn-out copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations that I kept in my locker, I found a different kind of strength. I'd read the words of the Stoic philosopher emperor by the dim light of my bunk. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The injustice, the betrayal, the loneliness, they were no longer just wounds. They were the terrain I had to navigate. They were the weight in my pack that would make me stronger. My life in Charleston was something that had happened to me. My life in the Army was something I was building. It was in this crucible that I found the first thing that resembled a real family in years. It wasn't warm or gentle. It was forged in shared hardship. And it came in the form of Drill Sergeant Miller, a combat veteran with a face like a roadmap of every battle he'd ever fought. He was tough, demanding, and saw everything. He never offered praise easily, but what he did offer was something far more valuable: objective fairness. During a critical field training exercise, we were running a fire mission simulation. My calculations were off, just by a few meters, but in our world, a few meters could mean the difference between hitting the target and hitting your own troops. I felt a flush of shame, bracing for the verbal lashing I knew was coming. But Miller didn't yell. He walked over, looked at my figures, then looked me dead in the eye. His voice was low and steady. Specialist Owen, in the field, a small mistake gets your brothers and sisters killed. Do it again. There was no condescension in his voice, no pity, no disdain. Just a statement of fact, a demand for excellence, and an underlying acknowledgement that I was part of a team whose lives depended on my competence. For the first time, I was being judged not on who my family was or what I was supposed to be, but on what I could do. That moment was a turning point. I redid the calculations, my focus absolute. This time, they were perfect. The months of relentless effort culminated in the final artillery skills proficiency test. It was a comprehensive exam covering everything from tactical knowledge to hands-on equipment operation. The results were posted, and the top graduates of the class were called out one by one during our final formation. When they called my name for the number 1 spot, a hush fell over the platoon. I saw some of the guys who had outrun me on day 1 exchange surprised looks. I walked forward, my back straight, my gaze fixed ahead. The company commander handed me the certificate of achievement. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a triumphant speech. I simply accepted it with a crisp nod, rendered a sharp salute, and returned to my place in the ranks. But inside, a quiet revolution was taking place. In that silent, solitary moment, I felt a sense of self-worth that was completely my own. It hadn't been given to me. It hadn't been inherited. It had been earned. It was built from Oklahoma dirt, from sweat, from gunpowder, and from the cold, hard logic of mathematics. It was a value that Janet, with all her inherited wealth and social maneuvering, could never touch and would never, ever understand. I had found my own worth on my own terms, on my own battlefield. The certificate from my proficiency test was a tangible piece of evidence of the person I was becoming. It was a validation earned in the dust and heat of Oklahoma. But 6 months before Janet's fateful phone call, another kind of validation arrived, this one from the world I had left behind. It came not as a formal document, but as a ghost in the machine, a single, encrypted email that materialized in my inbox. The sender was Arthur Harrison, my mother's estate lawyer and one of the few people from my old life I still trusted. The subject line contained only one word: warning. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. The message was brief, professional, and chilling. Arthur explained that he had detected unusual and repeated inquiries into the trust's structure, originating from financial advisors connected to Janet. He detailed the probing, legally veiled attempts to find loopholes. The email concluded not with advice, but with a question that showed a profound understanding of who I had become. It read, Elizabeth tasked me with protecting her legacy. Specialist Owen, what are your orders? What are your orders, not what should we do? Or, you should be aware. He was addressing me not as a grieving daughter, but as a commander. For the first time, someone from that world was seeing me not as the girl who left, but as the soldier who returned. I requested a 3-day leave and booked a flight to Boston. The contrast between Fort Sill and Boston's financial district was jarring. I went from the flat, dusty earth to a world of steel and glass that pierced the sky. Mr. Harrison's office was on the 40th floor of a skyscraper with a panoramic view of the city and the harbor beyond. The room was tastefully appointed with dark wood, leather-bound books, and modern art. A quiet fortress of power and influence, it was a world away from the genteel, decaying elegance of Charleston. This was where real power lived. Mr. Harrison greeted me not with a hug or a sad smile, but with a firm handshake. He was a man in his late 60s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Specialist Owen, he said, his voice calm and respectful. Thank you for coming. He didn't treat me like a child who needed protecting. He treated me like a client, a partner in a high-stakes strategic operation. He gestured for me to sit in one of the leather armchairs in front of his massive desk. He didn't offer me coffee or tea. Instead, he opened a polished wooden cabinet and retrieved a heavy crystal decanter and 2 glasses. Your mother always enjoyed a glass of this after a successful negotiation, he said, pouring 2 fingers of a deep amber liquid into each glass. Macallan 18. The name hit me with a jolt of memory. It was my mother's favorite scotch, a quiet luxury she indulged in on special occasions. The gesture was more than a polite offer of a drink. It was a symbol. He was honoring her memory, acknowledging the legacy I was here to protect. He slid a glass across the desk to me and took a seat. "Let's review the intelligence," he said. "All business now." He laid out a thin folder on the desk. "Janet is an opportunist, but she's not a master strategist. She's impatient and greedy, which means she's sloppy. She will leave a paper trail." He detailed every inquiry, every phone call his office had fielded from her associates. It was a clear pattern of reconnaissance, of testing the defenses before a full-scale assault. I listened, absorbing the information, my mind shifting into the tactical mode I had honed over the past few years. This was no different from analyzing enemy movements before a battle. "We need to do more than defend," I said, my voice steady. "We need to set a trap." A slow smile spread across Arthur's face. "I was hoping you'd say that," he replied. For the next 2 hours, we mapped out the strategy. We called it Contingency Plan Nightingale, a nod to my mother's love for the birds in her garden. The plan was twofold. First, we would reinforce the trust, adding legal fortifications that would make a direct assault nearly impossible. Second, and more importantly, we would turn the trust itself into a Venus flytrap. We intentionally left a few, carefully crafted, vulnerabilities, apparent loopholes that would seem like an easy entry point for a greedy amateur. Any attempt to exploit these weaknesses would trigger a silent alarm, logging the IP address and the exact nature of the attempt. We set up protocols to have any related phone calls to the bank or financial advisors automatically recorded, all within the legal framework of single-party consent laws where applicable. The entire structure was designed to encourage Janet to overplay her hand, to get her to commit an act of blatant fraud that would be impossible to deny. "We will let her own greed be the instrument of her downfall," Arthur said, his eyes gleaming with the sharp, predatory light of a lawyer who senses victory. "She'll think she's being clever, outsmarting a dead woman and an absent soldier. She'll walk right into it." As our meeting concluded, the strategic tension in the room subsided. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his gaze softening as he looked at me. The lawyer receded, and the old family friend emerged. "Rose," he said, his voice dropping to a gentle, almost paternal tone. "Your mother would be so incredibly proud of the woman you've become." He paused, letting the words settle in the quiet room. "She always used to say to me, 'My daughter has a spine of steel.' She was right." Those simple words were a gut punch of the most profound and healing kind. It was the validation I had spent more than a decade craving from my father, to be seen not as difficult or stubborn, but as strong. To have my core character recognized and valued. My eyes stung with tears I refused to let fall. In the Army, you learn to control your emotions, to compartmentalize. I held on to that training now. The discipline serving not to suppress the feeling, but to honor it, to hold it without shattering. I couldn't speak. I just gave a single, firm nod of acknowledgement. A nod that said everything. "Thank you. I heard you. I needed that." I left his office that day feeling a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. The lonely soldier now had air support. The isolated outpost now had a fortified rear base. I had an ally. And together, we had laid the perfect trap. All we had to do now was wait for the enemy to make her move. The warmth I had felt in Arthur Harrison's office, the profound sense of having a fortified position, lingered for months. It was a shield. But every soldier knows that no defensive line is ever truly impenetrable. The enemy will always probe for weaknesses. The first probe from Janet wasn't a frontal assault, but a quiet, insidious act of psychological warfare that arrived in a neatly wrapped cardboard box. It was a package from Charleston. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a heavy leather-bound photo album with the words, "Our Family," embossed in gold on the cover. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I knew this wasn't a peace offering. It was a Trojan horse. My hands felt heavy as I opened it. The first few pages were harmless enough. Tiffany as a child, my father and Janet on their wedding day. But as I continued, the invasion began. It was a systematic erasure of history. There was a photo of a family Christmas, and where my mother's smiling face should have been next to my father, Janet's had been carefully pasted in its place from another picture. A vacation to the Grand Canyon I'd taken with my parents now only featured my dad and me, with a conspicuously empty space beside him. Photos of my mother by herself were gone entirely, replaced by professionally shot portraits of Tiffany. She hadn't just removed my mother, she had replaced her. She was rewriting our history, page by page, turning my mother into a ghost, a footnote in the grand news story of her family. It was a breathtakingly cruel act, a quiet campaign of annihilation aimed directly at my memory. I closed the album, my hands steady but my heart pounding with a cold, suppressed rage. This was a message. A declaration that she owned my past as well as my future. 3 months before her final, fateful call, the next probe came. This time, it was by phone, and she used my father as her mouthpiece. His voice on the line was hesitant, strained, the voice of a man reading from a script he didn't write. "Rose," he began. "Janet and I were talking." He cleared his throat. "You know, with Tiffany's wedding coming up, well, she just admires you so much. And Janet was wondering if you might consider, well, loaning Tiffany a small amount from your mother's trust, just to help with the down payment on their venue. Think of it as an early wedding gift." I could hear the puppet strings. Every word was coated in Janet's sickly sweet poison. "She admires you so much. A lie. A small amount. A test. Think of it as a gift. A guilt trip. The military teaches you to identify threats based on patterns." This was a classic flanking maneuver, using emotional blackmail as cover. I took a slow, deliberate breath, employing the same box breathing technique I used on the firing range to steady my hands. When I spoke, my voice was devoid of emotion. It was the voice of Specialist Owen, not his daughter. "Dad," I said, keeping my tone level and formal. "Mom's will is legally binding and very specific. The trust is designated for narrowly defined purposes, and I do not have the legal authority to alter those terms." I offered no anger, no argument, just the cold, hard wall of legality. On the other end of the line, I heard a faint, sharp whisper. Janet, coaching him from the sidelines. My father sighed, a sound of pure exhaustion and defeat. "I knew you'd say that," he mumbled, his voice flat. "You're always so rigid." The line went dead. He called me rigid. He didn't see it as me upholding my mother's final wishes. He saw it as me being difficult. The call was a failure for them, but it was just the opening salvo in a new phase of their campaign. A week later, the strange calls began. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister who lived in Florida, called me out of the blue. Her voice was laced with disappointment. "Rose, I heard you weren't being very supportive of your sister. Family is supposed to help family." Then a text message from an old family friend, someone who used to come over for barbecues when my mom was alive. "Heard you're doing well in the army, but sorry to hear you've become so tight-fisted. That's not how your mother raised you." The attacks were coming from all sides. Janet was conducting a smear campaign, painting me as a selfish, ungrateful daughter, a cold-hearted soldier who had forgotten the meaning of family. She was isolating me, poisoning the well of my past, ensuring that if and when the time came, I would have no one in my corner. Every call, every text, was a small, painful cut designed to make me bleed out emotionally. It was tempting to call them back, to defend myself, to scream the truth. But I knew that was what Janet wanted. She wanted me to engage, to get emotional, to look unhinged. An emotional response would only validate her narrative. Instead, I treated it as an intelligence-gathering operation. I documented every call and every text message, noting the date, time, and content. I then forwarded the compiled log to Arthur Harrison in a secure email. His response came within the hour. It was calm, precise, and validating. "This is a classic psychological preparation of the battlefield, Specialist," he wrote. "She is attempting to soften the target, you, and erode your morale before the main assault. She's trying to make you question yourself so that you'll be easier to break. My advice, hold your position. Do not engage. The more she does this, the more evidence of her malicious intent we have. Let her think her strategy is working. I looked at my phone, reading his words over and over. The anger was still there, a hot coil in my stomach. But layered over it was the cold calm of a strategist. He was right. This wasn't just a family squabble anymore. This was a coordinated attack. And Janet was making a classic mistake. She was revealing her movements before the battle had even begun. I was no longer just the target. I was the reconnaissance unit, watching the enemy move into position, knowing that their every step was bringing them closer to the trap I had set. The final confrontation was coming. I could feel it, and I would be ready. I knew Janet was moving her pieces into position, preparing for a final attack. The psychological warfare, the smear campaign, it was all designed to soften me up. I held my position, documenting her moves, waiting. My training taught me to anticipate enemy action. But the question that echoed in the quiet of my barracks room was, where would the final, decisive blow come from? I didn't have to wait long to find out. The answer arrived not with the subtlety of a sniper, but with the public blast of an artillery shell. It came as a text message from an old army buddy who had since moved back to South Carolina. "Hey Rose, congrats on the family news, I guess," it read, followed by a link. My brow furrowed. I clicked it, and my stomach plummeted. The link took me to the society pages of the Post and Courier, Charleston's most respected newspaper. There, in glossy, high-resolution color, was a professionally shot engagement photo of Tiffany and her fiancé, a smirking trust fund kid from a prominent banking family. The article was a nauseating tribute to Charleston's high society, filled with fawning descriptions of the couple's storied lineage and their plans for a lavish wedding. I scrolled through the saccharine details, feeling a growing sense of dread. And then I saw it. The final paragraph. The kill shot. The article quoted the mother of the bride-to-be, Janet Owen. "We are just so thrilled for Tiffany and Chad," the quote began, "and we are so incredibly grateful for the generous legacy left by my husband's late wife, Elizabeth. Her kindness and foresight have allowed the children to have such a wonderful start in their new life together." I read the sentence again, and again. The words blurred on the screen. It wasn't a lie, it was a public hijacking. In one perfectly crafted sentence, published for the entire city of Charleston to see, Janet had claimed ownership of my mother's legacy. She had posthumously recast my mother, Elizabeth Owen, into the benevolent benefactor for Tiffany's fairy tale wedding. She wasn't just trying to steal the money anymore, she was stealing my mother's name, her reputation for kindness, her very memory, and using it as a prop in her social climbing spectacle. The blood in my veins turned to ice, then to fire. This was no longer about a trust fund. This was desecration. It was a public act of disrespect so profound, so audacious, that it took my breath away. She had taken something sacred and twisted it into a tool for her own vanity. As if on cue, my phone rang. The screen lit up with a Charleston area code. It was Janet. I answered, my hand steady, my voice a dead calm I didn't recognize as my own. "Hello, Janet." Her voice dripped with the cloying sweetness of poisoned honey. "Rose, darling, did you see the article? I had my assistant send it to everyone. I just wanted to make sure your mother's name was honored properly. She was always so generous." The calculated cruelty of it was masterful. She was rubbing salt in a wound she had just publicly carved into me. And then, believing she had me cornered and defeated, she delivered the final barrage. "That trust of your mother's," she said, her voice dropping the fake sweetness for a triumphant purr. "It's going to serve a much better purpose now. It belongs to Tiffany. She needs a proper wedding in Nantucket, Rose, not whatever it is you're doing, playing soldier in those cheap uniforms." She let out a little laugh, a sound like glass shattering in my ear. "I told your father, if your mother were alive to see what you've become, she'd die of shame. Throwing away a respectable life for a government paycheck." Every word was a precision strike aimed at the foundations of my identity. My service, my mother's love, my entire existence. She thought she was delivering the final, crushing blow. She thought I would break, that I would cry or beg. She thought she had won. But I remained silent. Nothing to say, darling? She taunted. I disconnected the call without a word. The silence that followed was absolute. The quiet hum of the barracks' fluorescent lights seemed to roar in my ears. The rage that had been a slow burn for years was no longer a contained fire. It was a flashpoint, a controlled nuclear explosion detonating deep inside my soul. I stood up and walked to the small mirror hanging on my locker door. I looked at my own reflection, at the tired eyes, the severe haircut, the rigid posture. But for the first time, I didn't see a broken daughter. I didn't see a victim. I saw Specialist Rose Owen of the United States Army. I saw a soldier. A soldier who had sworn an oath to defend against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And I realized, in that moment, that a soldier has a sacred duty to protect the honor of the fallen. This was the moment the war truly began. This was no longer about family drama. It was about honor, legacy, and justice. This was for every person who has had to stand by while a loved one's memory was disrespected and twisted for someone else's gain. If you are standing with me on this, hit that like button and comment for Elizabeth down below, because what comes next is a battle you won't want to miss. I picked up my phone. My movements were calm, deliberate, devoid of any wasted motion. I didn't scroll through my contacts. I dialed the number from memory. It rang twice before he picked up. Arthur Harrison. My voice was as cold and hard as the steel of a howitzer barrel. Mr. Harrison, I said. It's Rose Owen. I paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat. Change of plans. We're not defending anymore. We're going on the offensive. Full force. The nuclear rage from Janet's call had passed. In its place, something far more dangerous had settled in. The cold, clear focus of a soldier with a mission. The time for defense was over. The time for absorbing blows and documenting enemy movements was done. Now, it was time to plan the counteroffensive. My first action was to establish a secure command center. I initiated a video call with Arthur Harrison. When his face appeared on my screen, framed by the mahogany bookshelves of his Boston office, he didn't see a distraught young woman. He saw a commander. His expression was calm, professional, ready. He had been waiting for this call. Mr. Harrison, I began, my voice flat and devoid of the fury that had consumed me just an hour before. The situation has escalated. The enemy has made a decisive public move. We are shifting from a defensive posture to a full-scale offensive. I could see a flicker of something in his eyes, not surprise, but a kind of grim admiration. He simply nodded. Understood, Specialist. Give me your commander's intent. I didn't hesitate. I had been formulating this in the moments after I hung up on Janet. Primary objective: neutralize the threat posed by Janet Owen completely and permanently. Secondary objective: force a moment of clarity for my father. Method of engagement: a direct, in-person confrontation utilizing the element of surprise and overwhelming, irrefutable evidence. Arthur leaned forward, a small, sharp smile playing on his lips. Consider it done, Commander. I'll have the intelligence dossiers prepared and ready for your arrival. We have everything. After the call, I turned my small barracks room into a war room. I pulled out a portable whiteboard I used for studying artillery charts and began to map out the operation. This wasn't a family problem anymore. It was a tactical scenario. At the top of the board, I wrote the mission title, Operation Nightingale. Underneath, I listed the key personnel. Targets: Janet Owen, Tiffany Owen, Robert Owen, father. Beside my father's name, I added a note: potential for realignment. Below that, assets: Arthur Harrison, legal support, the Nightingale dossier, ammunition. Finally, I drew a large circle in the center of the board. Engagement zone: the Charleston residence, 8H, hour, Saturday, 1500 hours. It was a cold, methodical process, and that was exactly what I needed. By stripping the emotion away and treating it like a military operation, I could control it. I could manage the outcome. As General Patton once said, a good plan, violently executed now, is better than a perfect plan next week. The time for perfect was over. The time for now had arrived. While Arthur and his team in Boston were assembling what he called the ammunition, I began my own preparations. His team worked like a well-oiled machine. I imagined them in their high-rise office, printing out transcripts of Janet's recorded calls to the bank, compiling the emails where she'd probed the trust's legal standing, and finalizing the forensic analysis of my father's forged signature on several documents. Each piece of paper was a bullet. The completed dossier wouldn't be a legal file. It would be a detailed report on enemy activity, compiled with military precision, each exhibit marked and cataloged for maximum impact. My preparation, however, was psychological. I made a deliberate choice not to review the evidence myself. I already knew what Janet had done. Looking at the proof now would only stir up the rage I had worked so hard to channel. Emotion was a liability in the field. It clouded judgment and created openings for the enemy. Janet thrived on emotional reactions. She fed on them. My greatest weapon against her wouldn't be the evidence itself, but the cold, dispassionate manner in which I presented it. So instead of looking at the dossier, I studied my enemy. I spent hours online, reading articles and academic papers on clinical narcissism and narcissistic personality disorder. I needed to understand her playbook. I learned that narcissists cannot handle public exposure. They build a fragile, perfect world around themselves, and the threat of that world shattering is their greatest fear. They also feed on narcissistic supply, the emotional reactions of others, whether it's admiration, fear, or anger. The key to defeating one, I realized, was to give them nothing. No arguments, no tears, no raised voices, just the cold, indifferent presentation of facts. I would not engage her in a fight. I would simply present a statement of facts and watch her carefully constructed reality crumble. When I felt my mind was sufficiently fortified, I began the final logistical steps. I booked a one-way flight to Charleston for the upcoming Saturday. I packed a small duffel bag with only the essentials. I didn't pack civilian clothes. My uniform was all I needed. From its protective garment bag in my locker, I carefully took out my Army service uniform, the formal dress blues. The deep blue jacket, the crisp white shirt, the perfectly creased trousers, the gleaming brass buttons, the colorful ribbons on my chest signifying my service and qualifications. This wasn't just a uniform, it was a symbol of everything Janet despised and belittled. It was a suit of armor forged in discipline and sacrifice. I wasn't going home as Rose, the broken daughter. I was returning as Specialist Owen of the United States Army, an officer of the Court of Justice I was about to convene. I was there to restore order. With my bag packed and the uniform hanging, ready for deployment, I took out my phone. I sent a single, concise text message to my father. No greeting, no small talk, just the order. I am flying home this Saturday. We will have a family meeting at the house at 3 p.m. Your presence is mandatory. The flight from Oklahoma to South Carolina was a silent void. I didn't listen to music. I didn't read. I simply existed, my mind a calm, clear battle space, every contingency planned for. When the plane landed at Charleston International, I moved with the practiced efficiency of a soldier on deployment. I took a taxi directly to the house, the one that used to be my home, now Janet's palace. The dossier, thick and heavy with facts, sat in my briefcase like a field-ready weapon. I walked up the familiar oyster shell driveway and didn't bother to ring the bell. I used my old key. It slid into the lock with a familiar click. The door swung open into the grand foyer, and I stepped inside. 8th hour had begun. They were in the living room, just as I'd anticipated, my father, Tiffany, and Janet lounging in the casual luxury of a Saturday afternoon. The room was Janet's masterpiece of Southern classic decor, dark mahogany furniture, Persian rugs, and oil portraits on the walls, including a large, ostentatious one of her and Tiffany. It was the seat of her power, her self-made kingdom. My text had clearly been an order, not a request, and they were waiting, expecting a tearful, emotional confrontation from the daughter they thought they knew. Then, they saw me. The chatter stopped. 3 pairs of eyes locked onto me, and the air in the room froze. It wasn't just my sudden appearance that stunned them into silence. It was what I was wearing. My Army service uniform. The dress blues. The deep blue jacket was perfectly pressed, the brass buttons gleamed under the light of the crystal chandelier, and the ribbons on my chest told a story of service they could never comprehend. It was a suit of authority, of discipline, of a world utterly alien to their soft, privileged lives. My father's jaw went slack. Tiffany looked like she'd seen a ghost. Janet's polite smile faltered, her eyes narrowing with a flicker of confusion, then annoyance. She was the queen in this castle, and an uninvited soldier had just breached her throne room. She recovered first, her voice regaining its familiar, condescending tone. "Well, look what the cat dragged in. Rose, what on earth are you wearing? Playing dress-up?" I ignored her. I walked to the center of the room, my polished leather shoes making no sound on the thick rug. I placed my briefcase on the heavy oak coffee table. I did not sit. I stood, feet planted shoulder-width apart in a perfect parade rest. I occupied the space. I commanded it. "I won't waste your time," I said. My voice was even, measured, the voice I used to give a situation report, devoid of any emotion. It echoed slightly in the sudden, heavy silence. At 1400 hours on March 15th, I received a phone call from Janet Owen, in which she stated her intention to illegally seize control of the trust fund established by my mother, Elizabeth Owen. That call was legally recorded. I reached into my briefcase, took out a small gray digital voice recorder, and placed it on the table. A soft click as it made contact with the wood. Janet's face went pale. You have no right," she stammered, her voice losing its composure. "I have every right," I replied, my eyes still fixed on my father. I reached back into the briefcase and retrieved the dossier. It was nearly 3 inches thick, bound in a simple black cover with a single white label. Nightingale. I placed it on the table directly in front of my father, sliding it across the polished surface. The sound was definitive. Final. "This," I said, my voice unwavering, "is a complete record of Janet's attempts to infiltrate that trust over the last 6 months. It includes copies of her emails to the bank, transcripts of her recorded phone calls making inquiries, and a forensic analysis of your forged signature on several financial documents. It's all there. I invite you to review it." My father stared at the black binder as if it were a venomous snake. For a moment, he looked from it to me, then to Janet, a deep-set skepticism in his eyes. He had lived in Janet's reality for so long, he couldn't imagine another one. But my presence, my uniform, my unshakable calm, it was enough to make him doubt. Hesitantly, he reached out and opened the cover. What followed was the complete and total disintegration of Janet's world. As my father turned the first page, his expression began to shift. The skepticism melted away, replaced by a dawning confusion. He read the transcript of Janet's first call to the bank, his brow furrowed. He turned another page, and another. I watched his face as he saw the email chains, the blatant lies. I saw the moment he reached the signature analysis report, the clinical, irrefutable proof of forgery. The confusion hardened into disbelief, then morphed into a horrifying, dawning comprehension. His face, which had been a mask of willful ignorance for 12 years, was now a canvas of raw, unfiltered shock. The room erupted. Tiffany burst into tears, a series of theatrical sobs. "Daddy, what is this? I don't understand." Janet shot to her feet, her carefully constructed composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. "It's lies, Robert. She's making it all up. She's always been a jealous, spiteful child," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She's trying to ruin our family." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I let the chaos swell around me, a storm of shrieks and sobs. I waited, my eyes locked on my father, who was now staring at a specific page, his hands trembling, his face a ghastly shade of white. He looked up from the page, his eyes meeting mine, and in them, I saw 12 years of denial collapsing in on itself. He looked at Janet, but it was as if he was seeing her for the first time. The spell was broken. I let the noise reach its peak. Then, I spoke again. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the hysteria like a razor. The trust fund is, and always has been, secure. Mr. Harrison ensured that. Janet never got a single penny. I paused, letting that fact sink in. Then I delivered the final, devastating blow. But in the course of his investigation, Mr. Harrison did uncover another financial discrepancy. It seems that for the past 5 years, Janet has been systematically withdrawing funds from your personal retirement accounts. That report, I said, nodding towards the binder, is on the final page. A deathly silence fell over the room. The only sound was a choked gasp from my father. Tiffany's sobs hitched and died in her throat. Janet, who had been in the middle of a screaming denial, froze. Her mouth hung open, all the color drained from her face. She looked at my father's expression of pure, cold fury, then back at me, at my unblinking, emotionless stare. She saw no mercy, no escape. The game was over. She staggered backward and collapsed into an armchair, her carefully crafted world utterly annihilated. The silence that fell in the wake of my final statement was heavier and more suffocating than any noise could ever be. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and life out of Janet's meticulously decorated throne room. The grand oil portraits on the walls seemed to watch the scene, their painted eyes holding a century of Southern judgment. Janet was a statue of ruin in the armchair. Tiffany's sobs had ceased, replaced by the silent, hiccuping breaths of a child who has just witnessed a world-ending catastrophe. My father remained frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair, his gaze fixed on the final page of the dossier, as if the words were burning themselves into his soul. The explosion was over. This was the fallout. The quiet, grim work of surveying the damage. It was my father who spoke first. His voice, when it came, was a sound I hadn't heard in over a decade. It was hoarse, trembling, but underneath the tremor was a foundation of steel I thought had rusted away years ago. It was the voice of the man who had taught me how to sail, the man who had once been my hero. He didn't look at me. His eyes were locked on Janet. "Janet," he said, the name coming out like a shard of glass. "You and Tiffany, pack your things, get out of my house, now." The spell of silence was broken, and Janet jolted as if struck. "Robert, no! You can't believe her over me. After everything I've done for this family," she pleaded, her voice a desperate, shrill cry. "She's a liar." My father slowly lifted his head. The look in his eyes was terrifying. It was the cold, dead calm of a placid sea after a hurricane has passed. All the anger had burned away, leaving behind nothing but desolate certainty. "I have 12 years of lies sitting on the table in front of me," he said, his voice dangerously low. "The only liar in this room is you. Get out." That was when the real collapse began. It wasn't the dramatic, cinematic breakdown of a villain. It was the pathetic, frantic scrambling of a cornered animal. Tiffany ran to my father, grabbing his arm. "Uncle Robert, please, I didn't know. I swear, it was all her. I didn't know anything," she wailed, using the name she'd called him as a child. A last-ditch effort to pull on heartstrings that had already snapped. He gently but firmly removed her hand from his arm, his face impassive. I just watched. I had expected to feel a surge of triumph, a wave of vindication. But there was nothing. No satisfaction, no joy in her defeat. There was only a profound, hollow exhaustion that settled deep into my bones. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind an ache. The war was over, but the battlefield was my own home, my own family. And there were no real winners here. I had fought for so long, and now that it was done, all I felt was empty. While they scurried upstairs, the sounds of drawers being wrenched open and closets being emptied echoing through the house, I didn't move. I didn't follow them with my eyes as they dragged suitcases down the grand staircase. My gaze was fixed on the wall above the fireplace, at the serene, anonymous landscape painting Janet had hung there. The place where my mother's portrait used to be, a soulless replacement for a vibrant soul. That was what this house had become. That was what our family had become. After they were gone, the front door slamming shut with a final, echoing thud, a silence of a different kind fell. It was no longer tense, but heavy with the weight of unspoken words and years of neglect. The air, once thick with the cloying scent of Janet's gardenia perfume, now just smelled stale. It was just me and my father, two strangers in a house full of ghosts. He slumped into his chair, the energy seeming to drain out of him all at once. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "Rose," he mumbled into his palms. "God, Rose, I'm sorry." There it was, the apology I had craved for a decade, the words I had replayed in my mind 1,000 times. But hearing them now, in the wreckage of our family, they sounded foreign. They were just words, too small to cover the vast, empty space between us. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading. "How long did you know?" he asked, his voice cracking. I took a deep breath. I felt no need to accuse, no need for an "I told you so." There was no victory in his pain. I just gave him the truth. "For a long time, Dad." My voice was quiet, tired. But in the army, they teach you not to engage without solid intelligence and a viable plan. My answer seemed to hang in the air, a testament to the new reality. I was no longer his little girl, waiting for him to fix things. I was a strategist who had executed a mission. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. "I should have seen it. I should have listened to you." He started to stand, a desperate need to fix everything immediately written all over his face. We can fix this, Rose. We can start over. I'll get your mother's portrait back up. We can." I held up a hand, a small, simple gesture that stopped him cold. The captain was giving an order. "Dad," I said, my voice gentle, but firm. "I'm tired. I need time." I looked around the cold, opulent room, a monument to 12 years of lies. "And so do you. You need to face the last 12 years on your own." I wasn't staying the night. The thought of sleeping in my old room, in this house that was no longer a home, felt impossible. This wasn't a punishment, it was a tactical necessity, an act of self-preservation. I picked up my briefcase from the table. "I've booked a hotel room in town." He looked utterly defeated, but he nodded, understanding. The healing, if it was ever going to happen, couldn't be rushed. The wounds were too deep. As I walked out the front door, leaving him alone in the cavernous silence of his broken home, a final thought settled in my mind. I had won. I had reclaimed my mother's honor and taken back our house from the usurper. But as the door clicked shut behind me, I realized I needed time to decide if it was still my home. 5 years. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, other times, the blink of an eye. The person who walked out of that Charleston house into the lonely quiet of a hotel room is a stranger to me now, a ghost from a war fought long ago. The rage has cooled, the grief has softened, and the battlefield has been transformed into a foundation. Today, my uniform is a tailored, navy blue suit. My stage is a brightly lit conference room in Austin, Texas. My audience is a group of soldiers, sailors, and airmen, all within months of transitioning out of the military and into civilian life. They sit before me, their faces a mixture of apprehension and hope, the same emotions I once felt. Behind me, on a large screen, is a logo. A stylized nightingale in flight, its wings forming the letters E and O. Below it, the words, "The Elizabeth Owen Group." The most difficult mission for any soldier isn't on the battlefield, I say, my voice calm and clear, resonating with an authority I earned not on the battlefield, but in the fight for my own life. It's the one you face when you come home. It's finding your new purpose, your new identity. My mother, Elizabeth Owen, was a brilliant strategist. She taught me that your greatest asset is the ability to turn any situation into an advantage. That's what we do here. We help you take the skills you've learned, the discipline, the leadership, the integrity, and we help you build something of your own. As I speak, my eyes scan the room and land on a man sitting quietly in the back row. He isn't in uniform. He's older, his hair now more silver than brown. But he sits with a quiet pride that fills the entire room for me. It's my father. He divorced Janet a month after that fateful Saturday. Faced with incontrovertible evidence of fraud and embezzlement, she took a meager settlement to avoid criminal prosecution and disappeared from our lives. My father sold the house in Charleston, that palace of painful memories, and spent the next few years in a quiet, solitary process of self-reflection. He had to face the man in the mirror and account for 12 years of willful blindness. It was a long and difficult road for him. A year ago, he moved to Austin. He's now a volunteer mentor at my company, using his decades of business experience to help young veterans write business plans. Our relationship wasn't rebuilt with apologies or grand emotional speeches. It was rebuilt slowly, brick by brick, with shared action, quiet understanding, and a foundation of mutual respect. He doesn't just tell me he's proud, he shows me every single day. Later that evening, long after the last of the veterans had left with new hope in their eyes, Dad and I were cleaning up the office. We were packing away some old storage boxes that had been shipped from Charleston, things of my mother's that he'd saved. "I still can't believe how much she kept," he said, his voice soft as he pulled out a dusty box labeled Rose Childhood. Inside were old report cards, crayon drawings, and a small worn teddy bear. And tucked at the very bottom, almost hidden, was a thick, cream-colored envelope. My name was written on the front in my mother's elegant cursive. It wasn't sealed. "I've never seen this before," Dad said, handing it to me with a sense of reverence. I slid the letter out. It was dated a month before she died, a time when she knew her days were numbered. My hands trembled slightly as I read the words she never had the chance to give me. "My dearest Rose," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I'm out of time. There is so much I want to tell you, so much I want to see you become. Know this, my love. The world will try to tell you who you are. It will try to put you in a box, define you by your name, your family, or your inheritance. Don't let it. Your true strength, your real power, doesn't lie in money or status. It lies in your unshakable spine of steel and in your ability to forge your own path. I have left you a financial legacy, yes, but that is just a tool. It's seed money. Its true purpose is not to make you comfortable, but to make you brave. Use what I've left you to build something entirely of your own. Something that is a testament not to what you were given, but to who you chose to become." Tears I didn't know I had left to cry welled in my eyes. My father placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. For so long, I had thought my mission was to protect her legacy. I never realized her final order was for me to create my own. In that moment, I remembered a passage from Jeremiah that had given me strength during my darkest days in the service. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." My mother's plan and God's plan had been the same all along. The final scene of our story doesn't take place in a boardroom or a house. It takes place on a quiet, sun-drenched afternoon at the Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. The air is still, filled with a sense of profound peace and the quiet dignity of heroes. Dad and I walk along a row of simple white headstones. We don't stop at the grave of a soldier. We stop at the grave of a civilian, a woman buried here alongside her father, a decorated colonel. The headstone reads, Elizabeth Owen, beloved mother, fearless pioneer, brilliant strategist. I kneel down and place a single, perfect red rose at the base of the cool marble. My father stands beside me, his voice thick with emotion. "She would be so proud of you, Rose, so incredibly proud." I look at her name, etched in stone, and a genuine, peaceful smile spreads across my face. The war is over. The ghosts are at rest. The dawn has broken. "I know she is," I say, my voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. And now her legacy is helping other soldiers find their own. I had not only protected my mother's legacy, I had made it immortal. My story began with an act of betrayal, but it ends with a legacy of hope. What I've learned through this entire war is that our deepest wounds truly can become the source of our greatest strengths. We don't always get to choose the battles life throws at us, but we absolutely can choose how to fight them and what we build from the ashes. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If this story resonated with you, please share your own moment of strength in the comments below. For more stories about resilience and justice, make sure you hit subscribe and join our community.